Okay, next we will discuss how Tucker Carlson has gone completely deranged with his love for Viktor Orban, a Hungarian far-right authoritarian. Okay, now let's discuss Tucker Carlson's disturbing fawning over Viktor Orban, the far-right authoritarian in charge of Hungary. So you may not know this, but as someone who sometimes watches Tucker Carlson, I'll turn him on at 8 p.m. I think he's at 8. He might be at 9. I forget. I think he plays when Maddow plays, but I also don't watch Maddow, so I watch both of them at some point. I don't know when, but sometimes I do. And I actually did catch a glimpse of Tucker in a different setting. And immediately, I knew it was Budapest because I saw the background, and he was, of course, in Hungary. So, as someone who really does care about far-right populism and far-right authoritarianism around the world, I immediately knew why he was in Hungary. It was because of Viktor Orban, who is this far-right figure, an illiberal individual, illiberal in the sense that he does not believe in liberal democracy, which is important. Liberal democracy is the foundation of basically the entirety of the West, especially the United States. Liberal democracy basically believes in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom to criticize your government, and also voting, electoral voting. It also is important and associated with capitalism in most of the world. So liberal democracy has been the defining feature of the West for around 200 years now. It's what makes America America. It's what makes the West democratic. And it is extremely important to keep liberal democracy, especially in the United States. And that's primarily why you will hear me talk about extol the benefits of liberal democracy. So Viktor Orban has degraded liberal democracy in Hungary. I know I probably don't have to tell you this, but Hungary is in Eastern Europe, at least culturally and historically, which is important because Western Europe tends to have much stronger liberal institutions than Eastern Europe. And the reason why is because they had 50 more years to develop them. 50 more years because the Soviet Union had strong control over many of these countries in the Eastern Bloc. So as a result of that, much of the fight against communism tended to stem from a nationalism that was homegrown. So the right in Eastern Europe is much more nationalist than the right in Western Europe. Although that may be changing if you look at Le Pen and you look at the movements in Italy and you look at even the conservative movement that has begun to be a lot more nationalist in Britain. But for the most part, Law and Justice in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary are just much more right-wing and much more nationalist than the nationalisms in Western Europe. What sets Orban apart from his contemporaries in France, well, maybe not France, but his contemporaries in the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands and in even Canada, right? I can't really say the United States because we're talking about the United States and how they're trying to begin to copy Hungary in terms of conservatism. The difference between them is that I think that at the very basic levels, Boris Johnson buys into liberal democracy. He buys into the idea that there should be freedom of the press, that there should be freedom of speech, and that there should be freedom of assembly, and all these freedoms that we take for granted in the West. And that's because British political culture broadly agrees with that. The difference, however, and what we're beginning to see in even America, is that the right in Hungary simply does not agree with that. And the right in Hungary seems to agree with power for the sake of power. And we mentioned this beforehand in the last show, where I said the Republican Party has abandoned policy and they've begun a primarily culturally based war on the Democratic Party. Fidesz has done something similar. It's tied its opposition to LGBTQ movements, to immigration, and as a result, the Viktor Orban ministry has gone completely off the rails, attacking LGBTQ rights, attacking immigrants, refusing to allow passage of immigrants into even not just Hungary, but even parts of Europe. So Hungary has become a far-right nation based around Viktor Orban and his cronies, because Orban is not some benevolent figure. He is extremely dangerous because he also is trying to maximize his own power by giving a lot of the institutions over to his friends. And that is extremely cronyist, and you may remember someone doing that in the United States by the name of Donald John Trump. And of course he was defeated, and he tried to hold power despite losing the election, and losing the election by a lot, as he likes to say. But Orban has actually degraded the institutions that were already weak in Hungary. He's degraded them to the extent that it's possible that he becomes a dictator, which is something that really wasn't true for Trump. Trump couldn't have become a dictator in the United States. Orban can become a dictator in Hungary. In fact, frankly, his own party was worried about that. When I say his own party, I'm actually not referring to Fidesz, to be clear. I'm referring to the European People's Party, which is so basically every party in Europe that is part of the European Union is generally part of a European coalition. So for instance, the Socialist Party in France, the Social Democrats of Germany, they're part of the big party called the Party of European Socialists. Orban's Fidesz is technically a Christian democratic party. Christian democracy is the mixture of democratic values and Christian values into one. They generally support center-left economic agendas and center-right social agendas. Orban, of course, isn't really a Christian Democrat in that sense. He's much more authoritarian than Christian Democrats tend to be, and he's a lot more illiberal than Christian Democrats tend to be. So the European People's Party, in fact, kicked him out because they said that he wasn't a Christian Democrat because he's trying to become a dictator. And Orban's Fidesz just left the European People's Party as a result. So Orban is an illiberal. He has told his supporters that he does not believe in political debate, that he thinks that there's no point in taking different viewpoints into account because he knows what's best for the country. He does not believe in democratic debate. He's said that multiple times. And he has actually owned the title of illiberal, but he's used the term liberal to mean sort of like owning the libs in the US. He said that liberals are actually evil because they support multiculturalism. So illiberalism is Hungary for the Hungarians, which is, of course, a very open nationalist statement. So is he a Christian Democrat? Well, no, he really isn't. It seems like he is a opportunist. He is a illiberal opportunist who believes in ethno-nationalism. And of course, Tucker Carlson decided to go down to Budapest and give him a very fawning interview. In fact, a very funny story from this interview. And I read this on Raw Story, which is a liberal publication, but I think this is still true. Tucker Carlson's interview. So I watched Tucker Carlson's interview, the entire interview with Orban. I thought it was disgusting, frankly. It was an absolute cartoonish, depraved tongue bath of Orban. And I really want you to watch it if you haven't watched it already. Because Orban is even himself, by the American journalist, giving him a tongue bath. It's actually extremely crazy, and I really want you to watch it. It's interesting television, but really, really dumb from a political standpoint. Regardless, inside the interview, he asks Orban about Xi Jinping. Now, if he was smart, he wouldn't do that, because it's very clear that Orban is an authoritarian, and Xi Jinping is an authoritarian. And in the battle between the EU and China, Hungary has tried to side with China more than once. So Hungary sides with China. So of course, Hungary's not going to talk smack on Xi Jinping. So when Tucker Carlson asked him a question about Xi Jinping, I forget what the question actually was, but it was a sort of pointed attack on Xi Jinping. And I think he was trying to relate him to the liberals, the Democrats, or whatever, like he tends to do, which is crazy and stupid. But regardless, Tucker asks Orban on Xi Jinping, and Orban sidesteps the question. In Hungarian media, they just delete that from the transcript. They delete the entire thing from the transcript. And that just shows how Tucker Carlson likes to complain about cancel culture and censorship when the society that he loves, the society that he claims to love, which is Hungary. He even says, I believe that Hungary is better than America. Hungary is more free than America, which means that Hungary is better for white people than America, which I don't even think is true regardless. I would much rather live in the United States as a white person with the $65,000 GDP per capita than live in, the trash heap of Budapest. And by the way, Hungary is a beautiful country. I'm not trying to trash Hungary, actually, so I shouldn't say that. I love Hungary. But I wouldn't live in Budapest rather than live in New York City, because New York City is a beautiful city. Even Baltimore is a beautiful city compared to Budapest. But regardless, Tucker Carlson has a sort of meltdown, a speech that I almost assume he gave drunk because it was completely crazy. But I'm not going to play a portion of that speech here, primarily because I think the speech is pretty boring. But it is important to note that this is what Tucker Carlson wants for America. He does not care about liberal democracy. All the discussion of censorship and cancel culture and a country of liberal values is all BS. What he wants is an authoritarian, right-wing, I'm not going to say dictatorship, but a right-wing strongman that will make the country great again. And that is a slippery slope to fascism. It truly is. And that's why I'm pretty shocked that this wasn't very widely covered it seemed like it was covered like on the front page of nowhere. So that's a bit disappointing because this is the Hitler goes down in Venice moment, where Hitler meets Mussolini in Venice. This is that moment. This is the moment where Lindbergh meets Hitler in Germany and uses that to spark the America First movement in the United States. This is that point in history. We are seeing an alliance of ideology regardless of other values. There is nothing about compassion, nothing about freedom, nothing. Because Orban's government is not a government of compassion, it's a government of cronyism. It's not a government of freedom, it's a government of repression. It's a government of getting arrested by the police when you're protesting the Orban government in Budapest, as occurred to some left-wing protesters. So this is the government that Tucker wants. Tucker wants the FBI to black bag Antifa protesters in Portland. This is the government Tucker wants, and we need to get that through our heads. We cannot let the Republicans win. We cannot let the right wing win, because this is the future that they envision. This party is more dangerous than the Bush Republicans. This party is more dangerous than the Reagan Republicans. Because for all of Reagan's faults, he did not want a dictatorship in the United States. Tucker Carlson is dangerously close to advocating for a dictatorship in the United States, which is extremely dangerous to anyone. And we need to fight it every step of the way. So with that, on that very happy note, subscribe to In Progress on YouTube. If you prefer the podcast, go to linktr.ee/raymondperez for the podcast on whatever platform you're looking for it on, and follow me on Twitter at @realrperez. After this, we will discuss the absolute collapse of Orban's sister government in Poland.